Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Mention offer code TRADITION for a special Christmas offer. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
When we look back on the struggles against modernism and the infiltration of the modernists in the church, we tend to look at things and speak of it as a great loss. The reality is a little different. The modernists were making great gains in the late 19th to the early 20th century, and it was through the actions of Pope St. Pius X in suppressing the modernist heresy that he is often looked at as having triumphed over the modernists. He pushed them deep underground for decades until they, of course, reemerged in the mid-20th century, decades after his own passing. But it's worth reminding ourselves that at one time, a pope stood up and triumphed over the modernists. But it also is a lesson here. You can win the battle, but you can lose the war. Pius X certainly triumphed in his lifetime over the modernists, but the battle was not kept up after he was gone. There's a lesson there, I think, for the church. There's a lesson there for the secular political culture at this moment. Many people are celebrating what happened in early November. But it's worth reminding ourselves you can win the battle and lose the war. Michael Davies here celebrates Pope St. Pius X for defeating the modernists, for triumphing over them. And learn the lesson from this, that you can win the battle, but you can lose the war if someone else, when you're gone, does not take up the battle for you. When reading the propositions condemned by St. Pius X, it is hard to believe that the decree was not addressed to the errors that had been circulating in the Church since the Second Vatican Council. It came as no surprise when, just as Pope Pius IX had followed his syllabus with the encyclical Quanta Cura, St. Pius X followed his syllabus with the encyclical Pascendi Gregis. In both cases, the authority of the encyclicals, which are papal acts, considerably exceeds that of the syllabi. The encyclical Pascendi fell upon the modernists like a hammer blow. The great majority of Catholics accepted it with unqualified obedience, but in all the countries which had been infected with modernism, attempts were made to stir up opposition to the Pope and win support for the heresy. In the book Pope John's Council, an appendix is included summarizing Cardinal Manning's description of the press reaction to the First Vatican Council. There was a similar reaction to Pascendi, which is not surprising, as the forces that had vented their fury against Pope Pius IX had become even more powerful by the turn of the century. Cardinal Manning described the support given to the opposition at the council in terms which were equally applicable to the support given to the modernists. Quote, "In a moment when all the world rose up to meet them, governments, politicians, newspapers, schismatical, heretical, infidel, our elder brothers, revolutionary as with one unerring instinct, united in extolling and setting forth the virtue, learning, science, eloquence, nobleness, heroism of this international opposition. With an iteration truly Homeric, certain epithets were perpetually linked to certain names. All who were against Rome were written up. All who were for Rome were written down." End quote. There was certainly cooperation among the modernists in different countries in mounting their campaign against the encyclical, a fact made clear by the speed with which their responses were translated into different languages. Some of them denied recognizing their ideas in the encyclical. An Italian modernist named Bonate claimed that the Pope had condemned a phantom heresy. Most of the modernists submitted, but some preferred to leave the church rather than abandon their errors. Tyrrell and Loisy were among them. Loisy had already abandoned his priestly functions in 1906. He broke with the church after the publication of the encyclical and was formally excommunicated in 1908. Having failed to change the church from within, he then proceeded to attack her from without. Given the anti-Catholic bias of the French state education system, it is hardly surprising that it soon provided him with a prestigious teaching post. Professor of religions at the Collège de France, a position which he occupied from 1909 until 1930, he devoted the remainder of his life to justifying modernism and documenting its history. A sad and rather pathetic fate for the man who had aspired to the status of a father of the church. In a typically sarcastic fashion, the Abbé Duchesne, who had escaped condemnation, wrote to his former protege, commenting, "Your passing will certainly be an irreparable loss for at least half a dozen people." While he had been allowed to remain within the church, spreading error under the guise of a Catholic theologian, Loisy had posed a great threat to the faith. Outside the church, he was no longer a danger. He could be seen for what he was and what he accused the church of being, an enemy of Christ and his gospel. Before his passing, Father Tyrrell had realized that the battle had been lost. but he still held out some hope for winning the war. In a letter to an Italian friend, dated 24th of August, 1908, he admitted sadly that he had looked around him. He could only conclude that the wave of modernist resistance was at the end of its forces and had done all that it could for the moment. But he hoped for the day would come when, thanks to a strident and secret preparation, we shall have won a much greater proportion of the army of the Church to the cause of liberty. If we substitute the word error for liberty, it would appear Tyrrell's dream has been fulfilled in the last 2 decades. Loisy was less optimistic. In a review of Tyrrell's posthumous work, Christianity at the Crossroads, he wrote that his own book, L'Evangile et Inglés, contained a modest program of reforms that might be necessary, but Tyrrell's book was a prophecy of revolution. Both of them can rest together in the graveyard of heresies. St. Pius X still felt that he had not adequately fulfilled his apostolic mandate even after placing the modernist books upon the index, approving the syllabus, publishing his encyclical, and excommunicating the modernist leaders. He realized that there were modernist sympathizers in influential positions who had escaped sanctions as their views had never been made public. On the 1st of September 1910, he published his motu proprio, Sacrorum Antistitum, which obliged every priest to sign an anti-modernist oath, the form of which is extremely detailed. No man of integrity holding modernist views could possibly have signed this oath, and it meant that for some decades at least, Catholic seminaries and universities were purged of the proponents of the heresy. The anti-modernist oath aroused much, if not more, opposition than the encyclical itself. It was particularly resented by academics, especially in Germany. Protestant faculties expressed solidarity with their Catholic colleagues in their hour of trial. But when all the shouting died down, only 24 priests throughout Europe refused to sign the oath. Some of them joined Protestant groups, others joined the Old Catholics. Following the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI abolished both the Index of Forbidden Books and the anti-modernist oath. When the furor arose by the oath had subsided, St. Pius X had succeeded in purging the Church of at least the external expression of the modernist heresy. Quote, "When all was said and done," wrote Henry Daniel Ropes, "Pius X had triumphed. The reasons for the triumph of Pius X are easy to discover. Firstly, he had a correct sense of priorities, and he knew that, as Pope, his first duty was to preserve intact the deposit of faith. Secondly, when the doctrine of the modernists became clearly heretical, he condemned them all at once. But he did not stop at condemnation. Condemnation which is not enforced is worthless. Furthermore, the Pope not only took steps to excommunicate obdurate public modernists, but to purge the Church of their clandestine counterparts, or at least to compel them to submit. Had he not taken these forceful measures, the heresy would have spread throughout the Church with disastrous consequences. But God sent us a saint to prevent this happening, a saint who has said as his motto, to restore all things in Christ, which was precisely what he did." End quote. A short lesson from Michael Davies, but a pertinent one. Do we lose the battle, or do we win the battle? Do we lose the war, or do we win the war? Something worth reminding ourselves of. The modernists don't openly speak about Loisy and Tyrrell and all these other names that have been essentially lost to history. They do sometimes speak of Chardin. He's about the only figure that they speak about, but they don't need to speak about the others. They are just in the family tree of their bad theology. Their successors picked up their work and continued it for them, until they had people of like mind at the council, working the bishops, who were otherwise Catholic bishops, to change the faith, to adopt ambiguous documents that would allow the modernists to run wild after the council and its implementation. And of course, some of those documents were purposely written to be implemented that way, with that intent, explicitly, as said by the modernists at the council and afterwards. And I'm curious, what do you think about this? You think there's a pertinent lesson in this, in terms of context, that these notorious modernists of the early 20th century, they were defeated, resoundingly so. They lost their influence after the council, or after they were excommunicated. Their followers remained and continued their work very quietly. Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So just sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.